Welcome to another policy video from the Ontario 360 project, housed at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm Sean Spear, a project co-director of the Ontario 360 project and a senior fellow at the Munk School. I'm joined, as always, by my project co-director, Drew Fagan, a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and our guest today, David McGown, who, amongst other things, runs the Canadian Business Coalition for Climate Policy. We're so honored to have David join us today to talk about a two-part policy series that he's released with us at the Ontario 360 project. That series is called The Politics of Emissions Reduction in Ontario. The first part's entitled The Road to Today, and the second is The Path Forward, and we're honored to be able to speak to him about this a sweeping analysis of where we've been on climate policy in Ontario and where we ought to go in the context of the forthcoming election and, of course, post-election transition. David, thanks for your contribution and thanks for speaking with us today.
It's a real pleasure, Sean. Drew, great to see you again.
One of the key insights of the first part of this two-part series, David, is that notwithstanding the political and partisan tensions around issues of climate policy in Ontario, that in recent history, climate policy has been the source of some political convergence. That might surprise viewers. Do you want to just unpack this idea that not that long ago, climate policy was something for which you might even say there was a political consensus in Ontario?
Sean, in fact, that framing is, I think, entirely accurate, and at one level also entirely surprising. I've kicked around federal and Ontario politics since the early 80s. And have paid what I thought was pretty close attention to the ebbs and flows of political discourse. And when I think about policies and political challenges in, with respect to the environment or climate, I think about Walkerton or renewable energy. I think about Stéphane Dion and the green shift in 2008 at the federal level, that I would date as sort of the ground zero, if you will, for the beginning of a partisan conversation in Ottawa on climate. And I would differentiate that from political conversations on public policy issues generally. And in Ontario, when I was kind of combing through political documents and election platforms, the thing that stood out for me, and that quite bluntly surprised me, was the fact that for every provincial party from between the year 2000 and up to the election of 2014, every political party in Ontario supported the idea that Ontario should get out of the coal generation of electricity, and it was rarely, if ever, described as emissions policy. It was rarely, if ever, described as this is what we have to do to meet a Kyoto or a Paris or a Glasgow target. It was almost always framed as this is the right thing to do for the health of Ontario citizens. This is, it will get rid of smog, it will get rid of smog days. But the exit of coal from the electricity generation in Ontario was the single most important policy lever that any government in Canada could pull. And it was pulled with consensus across every party. And it resulted in the single largest reduction in GHG emissions in Canada over the first 15 years of this century.
Well, I suppose before I turn it over to Drew, it necessitates the obvious question: what happened?
Well, that's it is an excellent question, and that's probably that would probably necessitate yet another installment for Ontario 360. As I say, so the proxy I used for looking at this political consensus were the election platforms that the parties release prior to or during election campaigns, and it was there in that context it was clear that there was very little sunlight between each of the parties on this issue. As I say, my sense of why there was consensus was that the rallying cry, if you will, was focused on air quality, the health of Canadians, and and the issues around smog and smog days. There's probably I'll say somebody else's conversation or research might lead one down a road to say if the whole debate around GHG emission reductions, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if CO2 emissions were particulate, you could see them in the air, they clouded the sky, they made breathing difficult, we would be having a very different discussion again on whether or not carbon is good, bad, or indifferent. The fact that coal generation actually did not just contribute to GHG emissions, but other particulate. So you could actually see some of the evidence in the sky, I think, framed the conversation a little bit more towards air quality, health, and smog.
Yeah, there's an issue of the tangibility of it and an issue of the tragedy of the horizon, I think, as well, right? In the sense that it's hard for a short-term process like politics to digest long-term challenges. But the tangibility is a great point. So I want to ask you about the last 4 years and where Ontario policy went. And in particular, I think, the fight between the provincial government and the federal government with regard to the carbon tax, because I think you think of that to some extent as, past as prologue for the second part of your paper, which really looks at potential policies, thinking in the context of the remarkable degree of commonality of the parties, of just good, smart, nonpartisan policy initiatives for the province, whoever wins going forward. So the last 4 years maybe, and then we can go into the second part of the paper, which really is you thinking about where things can go from here to best effect.
So maybe an interesting place to start is actually this an initiative that I work with a number of Canadian corporations on, and that's Canadian Business for Climate Policy. And the idea behind this coalition, the need to create a business voice that would advocate for climate policy, really came, grew up around, the 2018, 2019, when you had, the Ford government come in and cancel cap and trade, when you had, the conversation that had been going on with the federal Conservatives in Ottawa, and continues actually today. There was a bit of a different stream for a few months, but that idea that it's actually good for business if there is a stable regime of climate policy in place, rather than these kind of 180-degree wild swings of carbon price today and no carbon price tomorrow, or regulation today and no regulation tomorrow. There's often a sense that business thrives in an environment where there is little or no regulation, and I think the counter to that is actually business. It's a bit of a truism. Business craves certainty. But certainty in climate policy doesn't mean rigidity, that there can never be change to climate policy, one government to the next, but that there should be a level of stability and certainty built into that, foundationally into policy, so that if I'm a business and buying an asset, making an investment, buying a company, selling a company, that I have reasonable certainty around what the climate policy treatment of that investment will be, 1, 2, or 5 years down the road. In the same way that, as a business person, if I, make an investment, buy an asset, I have reasonable certainty around the tax treatment of that transaction. And climate policy is, has become almost as foundational to how businesses think and plan and invest as tax policy has ever been. So that's that's kind of where I would start with that, Drew.
Excellent. Okay, so with that as background, let's move to the second part of the paper, again, in the context of what's happened most recently. Where do you think the best benefit can come, and how do we do that in the context of just what you said, which is to take some of the uncertainty out of it, make the policy making more policy as opposed to politics, and more stability for the longer term as opposed to short-term thinking? And you do have a number of ideas in the second part of the paper to that effect.
So if we look at the first 15 years of this century and see this, this all-party consensus grew up around the importance of getting rid of coal generation. The question I think it's we can ask ourselves is, can we recreate a consensus? Is there any other issue around which every party could actually rally and take Ontario's, the success that we've had in emissions reductions to date, take that, take that success and move it forward. And I actually think that the issue for Ontario parties, is to think about climate policy as actually policy in support of economic development. That is, good economic policy is good climate policy. Good climate policy is good economic policy. And when the next government, whatever flavor it may be, takes office in June, we're facing a world that is increasingly focused on the industrial sector, thinking about what its customers and clients are demanding of them. So Drew, you asked, what's the government done over the past 4 years? Beyond the cancellation of cap and trade, it invested $500 billion into Dofasco, just a month or so ago. And that $500 million will support Dofasco in getting out of higher carbon fuels and focusing on low carbon electrical furnaces. It takes, I think maybe 3 megatons of GHG emissions out of the air each year. It's a significant, $500 million is, it's a big bag of cash. But that that one-time investment will position Dofasco to be able to manufacture lower carbon steel, which is what its clients and customers, both in Canada and around the world, are demanding. GM and the other car manufacturers, when they think about where is our market going, that market is beginning to shift towards electric vehicles. And in 2018, we had an Ontario government that tore out EV charging stations, and this past month is putting them back in along the 400 series of highways. So these are all attributes of what could be a very thoughtful plan for economic development. And I think there are like 3 or 4 broad categories that we could be thinking about that in. The first is, we are in an era of energy transition, and whether we're not, there is no switch to flip in terms of turning off fossil fuels. I think the key word in this is really it's transition, and it's not tomorrow or next week, next month, or next year, but over time, as markets and customers push business and governments towards lower carbon solutions, there's a significant role for the provincial government in supporting investment and helping business to transition. If you think about what the government of Quebec did, it announced in 2020 basically a $6.5–7 billion program that focused, not exclusively on electrification, but almost primarily on electrification. And there are firms with operations in both Quebec and Ontario who are making investments in Quebec today because Quebec, the government of Quebec is there with financial support. Ottawa is there with financial support through the Transition Accelerator and the Strategic Innovation Fund and others to help businesses make these one-time capital investments to shift from how things are produced today to how things are produced tomorrow. Ontario needs to start thinking about energy transition investments as tools of economic development. The other piece in this kind of I call it a 3 or 4-legged stool on energy transition is, and this is is politically challenging for some parties, but I think it's time for Ontario to have its own carbon price.
Yeah.
And the way I think about this is if Ontario is subject to the rules and regulations of a carbon levy as imposed upon it by Ottawa, why wouldn't you say, thanks a lot, we'll create our own and allow the Ontario government to create, if you will, the rates, the rules, and how those dollars could or should be spent. And this concept of economic development through energy transition is not cheap. I mean, $500 million for Dofasco is simply, it's an acknowledgement of that's the kind of money that firms will need to make these transitions. So if Ontario implemented its own carbon price, and the way I think about this, keep lower income Ontario citizens whole through some kind of like HST rebate kind of thing, and then used those revenues as well to help fund energy transition, that would push Ontario's ability to be competitive domestically and internationally. It would advance our ability to be competitive domestically and internationally significantly.
That's a masterclass, David. Crossing a range of different policy issues and policy levers in this menu of policy recommendations set out in your paper. One of the reasons I like the paper so much is, to come back to your original thesis that there used to be a political convergence on issues of climate, that we lost that sometime in recent years, but that a new consensus can be built around this idea of an economic development and industrial development opportunity for the province. And then the question, of course, is what policy levers do you pull? You mentioned, the prospect of a new, what one might describe as a made in Ontario carbon pricing regime. I would note, for instance, that made in Ontario is a kind of frame that the current premier has used in different cases and may apply to carbon pricing, especially in the aftermath of the Supreme Court case affirming the federal policy. So at this stage, the question is only whether Ottawa imposes the carbon tax in Ontario, or the provincial government, as you say, designs a made in Ontario carbon pricing regime that then decides how best to recycle the revenues within the province. If I can just pick up on the set of really comprehensive recommendations, are there any others that you want to highlight here that could have kind of meaningful bang for the buck as the different parties seek to finalize their respective platforms and Ontario public servants do their work on post-election transition? Which ones do you think, in addition to some of the ones you've raised so far, are worth highlighting?
So, Sean, I think there are, again, two or three pieces to shine a light on. The first is actually how do we think about Ontario power generation over the course of the coming decade? And OPG is about to shut down Darlington because it's old and in need of doing that. A couple of its other generating stations are going offline for refurbishment and retrofitting, and that's going to mean that as nuclear comes off, which is a clean, no carbon source of energy, natural gas electricity generation is going to pick up, and so we're going to see an uptick in GHG emissions over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. We can mitigate that to a significant extent by thinking about how to blend and mix that fuel source with hydrogen or what's called renewable natural gas in order to take either of those technologies to scale. Firms are going to need both support in terms of R&D and market development, and market development. Markets have to be there. Urban transit, using hydrogen or renewable or other low carbon forms of natural gas can be and should be part of that mix. One of the a former federal minister of natural resources was Seamus O'Regan prior to the last election, and Seamus in a podcast last summer kind of looked at Canada's roadmap to both 2030 and to 2050, and we generally know the kinds of policy levers we need to pull in order to reduce GHG emissions to meet our 2030 commitments. I think the technical term is we don't have a clue exactly how we're going to get to 2050, and so when I think about the range of opportunities are there, and you'll forgive me if because I spent most of my career in the financial sector. I think about this a little. I think about the transition to net zero a little like a merchant bank. There are a bunch of technologies out there. There are a bunch of potential fuel sources, and we've actually got to make bets on all of them. We can't close a door or window, and today, if you invested in 10 different technologies, 5 or 6 of them are simply not going to work. The challenge for governments, for citizens, for business is we simply don't know which of those 5 or 6 are viable and which aren't. And so we actually have to make bets on all of them, knowing that some combination of known technology, known proven technology, and as one other institute called it, wildcards, are going to be what's needed to get us across the finish line in 2050. So for Ontario, investments in small modular reactors. Nuclear ought to be a foundational part of Ontario's energy future. It has been for decades. It can be in the future, and the investment in R&D and the development of SMRs, I think, is not just important for Ontario's continued low carbon electricity generation, but it also opens a significant path for a potential dynamic export market. The other technology is carbon capture, storage and utilization, and there are all kinds of folks in the climate movement who would stand up on their hind legs and say, a dollar invested there is a dollar that we're simply wasting, and it could be invested somewhere else. And I go back to, I don't believe that Ontario or Canada can afford to shut a door or window when it comes to charting the right path to get us to net zero in 2050.
Well, that's a compelling vision, David, and I think one that creates the conditions for a kind of renewed political consensus focused on climate policy. And for those policymakers watching today's video, they can go to the Ontario 360 website, on360.ca, to find David's papers entitled The Politics of Emissions Reduction in Ontario, Part 1, The Road to Today, Part 2, The Path Forward. David, thanks for joining Drew and I for today's conversation. Drew, as always, stay tuned. We'll be back with another Ontario 360 policy video in short order.